Hi, I'm Ben, and this is We're Done Pretending, a Reflective Rebels podcast. If your days define you instead of the other way around, if you're doing everything for everyone else whilst drifting through your own existence, then this is for you. Today, with me on the sofa is someone who's putting down their mask to share what's actually happening in their life. Not the polished LinkedIn version, but the honest truth about struggle and joy and mess and meaning. By listening, I hope you'll feel less alone in whatever you're going through. Maybe learn something about yourself and find the courage to make changes that feel good. Because we want more than just coping. We want a life that feels like ours. Let's listen to a fellow human. Welcome and thanks for joining me today. My first question to get us started is going to be, what's your favourite day of the week?
My favourite day of the week is Friday evening. So It's not a day, it's an evening.
it's an actual... What is it about Friday evening that's so special?
It's that all the everyday, the email and the telephone, I can ignore all that and I can actually then start to do what I think of as the week's work of concentrating, focused, and then I've got the weekend ahead without needing to be in that sort of conscious communication mood with everybody else. And I can actually drill down into my own ideas and my own rhythm of working.
Wow, so you're not stopping work at that point on a Friday evening? Because most of us, that would be the point at which we kind of think, whoa, work is finished. You're changing the rhythm of work.
Yeah, I can stop the bit that's, you're sort of caught in the 5-day week of having to respond to everything. And then I can actually zone out of that and move into a different sort of time and space.
Wow. So paint the picture for us then. Where are you in this moment?
I'd either be editing, like video, or I'd be downstairs, like making in my studio.
Making?
Yeah.
So what's the making?
Like drawing or painting or figuring out what to do with some materials I've collected, but really starting to lose myself into an imaginative space rather than a conscious space.
So it's a creative time then?
Yeah,
Friday evening.
That's it. The weekend is I wish could go on 7 days a week, but that's not realistic.
So what gets in the way? What's all the other stuff that gets in the way in the week that you wish you could just throw in the bin?
Well, the necessary parts of organising your work, interacting with people, making things happen, following through with arrangements, all of those have their virtues and have enjoyable parts. But my absolute favourite part is when you're just in that creative zone. And
what does that mean to you? What does that feel like?
I think my definition is that I would be then in what I would call mythological time. It's not time of the here and now. It's the time of a completely different scope. And sometimes that also, it's very often I'll be outdoors working, with the garden or with animals. But that's also time when my imagination can be free to roam. And it's where I often might solve a problem, work out a new idea, have an inspiration on something. It's just that I'm away from all that, the to-do list.
I love that phrase, mythological time. Do you label the other time? Does it have a label or just a special label for the mythological time?
It's the to-do list.
The to-do list and mythological time.
I think, say 20 odd years ago, I could do every Monday's my admin day, and I could do the to-do list on a Monday. And the difference is nowadays, that the technology, our communications have changed, the demands have changed. I could do the to-do list 7 days a week and I would never get through it. So I'm trying to contain it back to a Monday and then get the balance a bit better, but it's not always like that.
So how's that going? We've gone from 5 days. Is there any hope of getting it down to one?
Not right now.
And if you have the magic answer, could you share it with the rest of us, please?
I think there's a case of where it's just pure stubbornness that you've just got to say only so much is operational and so much is actually generating, the actual work. So I'm just working on that, but I haven't got the answer right now.
So you mentioned mythology and the outdoors and nature and creativity. Tell us more about that part of you and what that means to you.
I think that my, what gets me out of bed in the morning is always either to tend animals or to create work in, stories, images, whatever it is, and to hone them into end products, that I can share with other people. And there's always a mass of those on the go. And then it's a case of selecting what am I working on right now and how am I going to pursue that. And then there's a different part of me that becomes very, very practical and pragmatic. And the two have to push and pull.
Yeah. So at different points in your life, who wins out? How do you fight that balance?
I would say for a long time that the very, the practical, pragmatic has been dominating. And I've got really, I'm having my own rebellion against that. What's this next project and how is that going to happen? And the terms on which I'm going to pursue it. Rather than having the agenda set by external influences or demands, and then that taking me off down a different route, and then you wake up 5 years later and find you haven't actually done what you wanted to do, what you thought you were doing has become something completely different. Yeah. So
there's no agency in it. There's no you just sort of follow some habits for 5 years, and then you go, "What? How did I get here?"
Yeah.
I'm interested to wind back, maybe, if that's all right, to understand whether that part of you, this part that wants to be in this mythological time, has that always been there? Where that came from? Where those moments sort of started for you? Your first memories of mythological time? Where's the seed of it?
I think stories and visual stories have always been at the centre of my life, but I didn't necessarily recognise that when I was younger. But if I think back, what was that real first sense of that? It was after seeing a film. It was Franco Zeffirelli's Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, which I think if I watched it now, I'd probably think is quite a sort of, why does that inspire you? But I remember being probably like 8 at the time, and after watching it, absolutely being compelled to sit down and write the whole story down, and losing myself in the act of writing it and thinking about the story, and that sense of it having been a film, that I became a filmmaker. I think, though, that the themes of that will underline more or less everything that's been important in my life. So that affinity with nature, with ecology, and also the social values within that. So I think that would have been like a major point that I then buried.
And what do you mean buried? What does that mean?
Because you get caught up in what you're supposed to do or ought to do, or, the persona that makes it comfortable for everybody else rather than necessarily yourself.
Now, that is interesting, isn't it? So let's explore that a little bit, because those formative years from the age of 8 to sort of into early teens, where social pressures, and I think you said, what's expected. Tell us about those influences on you and how that affected.
I grew up on the border of Derbyshire and Cheshire, and I was really involved as a teenager with both the Manchester Youth Theatre and with punk rock, with a lot of friends in bands, making stuff. And I think those two things kept me sane outside of the conformity of school. And they were things that you just reacted to from your gut. You could reach into that imaginative world. But the third element was also roaming the moors on ponies, and just having this freedom, because, we're living on the edge of the moorland, and you just go out with friends for days on end. And so those three things were what really fed my spirit at that time.
I don't know which one of those to follow up. Punk rock, theatre and roaming the moors all sound like I could spend the next hour talking about them. Which one are you drawn to telling me about? I'm going to let you choose. Which one would you like to paint a picture of for us who maybe haven't had that experience, or who've got a version of that in our head, but what was it like for you?
I think it's that thing of finding what's the energy that you respond to about being alive. And so across my life, riding the pony has been really important. And there's this sense of freedom. But I was also reading recently about the sort of, Celtic symbolism of a pony on a coin. And it's that they're the spirit of the earth. And then I was starting to think about that in a completely different way and thinking, yeah, that is what it is. You just got this innate bond, but it's that energy that comes up through the hooves and you're in tune with that. So that was important. But I think the creative energy of the spontaneity, working on a very instinctive and intuitive way, were really important. And those are the things that are the hardest to maintain when you're trying to then bridge into, the world, earning a living, building a profession and a career, because you've got to conform to all sorts of other things whilst retaining your personality.
So is that the bit that became a bit stifling, that moment where you had to sort of get a job, if you like?
In some ways it did. I chose to go to film school, which combined a lot of my interests, and I pursued a career in feature film. And that, for me, for a long time, really fed me, because it was about working on stories and creating, fictitious worlds. And I just loved it.
Yeah. Tell us more about that then. So tell us a bit more about that first part, about film school perhaps. And
yeah, I went to film school in Manchester.
Yeah. And
I spent an awful lot of time in Granada Television, which was at its height of both drama and documentary production. And there were a couple of people there who really enabled me to access facilities or gave guidance that helped me get things made, and also learn what I did and didn't want to do. And I really learnt that I didn't want to work in a television studio, and that I wanted to work, that the most interesting parts to me were either coming up with the story or editing the story. And the big elaborate production mechanisms weren't of that much interest to me, but I had a real sense I wanted to direct. And that requires you to be part of that. So it's like conflict of, reality and ambition there.
There's a duality theme, I think, going through this, isn't there? Tell me, what early project where you really thought, yeah, I'm in the right place. This is what I want.
I worked on. I moved after leaving film school. I went down to London and I worked on international feature films as a script editor, production coordinator, different roles, and just learning really how does it work, but always trying to get my own things made. And I went in my late 20s on a European course, the European Audiovisual, EARVE it was called, and that was a complete door opener, because I just was never quite getting in there in Britain, in British culture. People would ask, what country are you from? Because I had a northern accent. There was all, and it was just, somehow I made friends with these people on the European course, and it just opened a whole new world. And from there, I became a screenwriter and producer on co-productions, and worked for over 20 years with a Finnish director on a whole range of films. But that was the door opening to starting to get my own work progressed, and also to getting things, to actually making things rather than working on other people's things.
So this podcast, part of what it's about is honing in on those turning points. So that feels to me like, you said, a door opening, but it's one of those moments I think I'm interested in exploring in people's lives to understand how they come about.
I think I was hitting a brick wall of getting my own, submitting my own scripts to funders in the UK, and just hitting a brick wall. And as soon as I met these European colleagues, I showed them a short script I'd written, and immediately somebody else wanted to make it. And then I just began talking with people, and immediately we were into concrete conversations about how to get a project made, and then started working on that. So it was really different, and it was just a different sense of how you approach, creating a story, how you work together, and different funding mechanisms.
Can you put your finger on what was different?
I'm not actually sure, but I think that I felt that in Europe, I was taken at face value. People saw me for who I am. There wasn't some judgmental thing, which I still feel in Britain. It's very important, where you're from, what you've done. There's all this sort of social strata, which in Europe, it was the quality of your work was what mattered. And that was very different. And that was just a big thing that it changed everything.
Mm. Do you still feel that now?
Yeah.
Doing what you're doing?
Yeah.
And how does that show up?
I think post-Brexit, because basically until Brexit, the majority of my work was in Europe.
Right.
And that thing of post-Brexit's made it much harder to collaborate on things. So then I focused more on what's possible within the UK. And I've found really good people to work with, really good opportunities. And I'm also aware of those lifelong barriers that if you're not badged up in a certain way, you're not part of that network. It wouldn't matter how good your work is. You will never... And I've just decided to... It's like a fish. I'm just swimming past that.
Yeah. I'm using that a lot with clients at the moment, that idea of just for a moment, stop trying to swim up the river and turn around and float down that way. And you seem to have been able to do that in the stories that you're telling, to find a way to remain true to yourself and shift the environment rather than change yourself to fit in.
I'd say I have been quite a shapeshifter.
Okay.
I have put on quite a number of different, uniforms over my life in order to enable certain things, or because I've felt pressured to do it. And I think more recently, I've just decided, I am who I am, and I just need to get on with it. And that I feel those compromises aren't worth making anymore.
Mm. Could we explore one of those times? One of those masks, if you like, or those characters, whatever language you would.
I'd say, well, first of all, I suppose this wasn't a mask, but I was very intent on making feature films, on fiction.
Yeah.
And that then, because there's a complexity in getting that made, I ended up with this Finnish director. We got a documentary made in Russia. And that was like, not so much a mask, but I had been very fixed on what I was going to do. And it was a real revelation to shift how can you tell a story and in what way. And when I wrote and produced that documentary, that again opened a whole new world, because you can be much more fluid in how you resource telling the story and how you go with the flow of what materials emerge within that. But whilst I was making that film, we were in Siberia, and we interviewed this Orthodox priest who had been, the only priest going into one of the still labour camps in that area. And after doing the interview with him, he then looked me straight in the eyes and said, but what's happened to your soul? And it went right through me, because it was like, he's dealing with, why is he saying that to me? And it really made me think and stopped me in my tracks. And I actually made a big change in my life after I finished shooting that film and before I edited it.
Well, there's lots to unpick there, isn't there? Can we start with, for those of us that don't understand the filmmaking process, you said you realised there was a different way to tell a story on that project. Could you explain what you mean by that? What was the different way, and what was different about it?
If it's a fiction film, a scripted film, the script is, if it were architecture, it's like the blueprint for a building. It's written down. It's all, there's a whole way that everything in the production is arranged around that script, costed, scheduled, cast, all of those things. So you can make changes, but you've got a huge tanker that you've got to turn when you make those changes. Whereas with the documentary, I made a story map. I knew what the map of what we were going to do, where that might come from, but we had no idea quite how that would come together. But I always knew what the turning points were going to be that I needed for us to explore that theme. And then when we went to make it, we uncovered all sorts of things, met, people. Serendipity had a part in some of the materials that became available, as well as huge challenges. But there was a sort of, how can I say, it's the fact you don't quite know. You've got to keep improvising and at the same time keep pulling it back to what you're trying to do without having a set end. You've got to keep it open to responding to some of the material that you find. So it's like if you were a detective, you can't decide at the beginning who's done it. You've got to keep it open, and you've got to keep playing devil's advocate to the material you're working with. And there's an energy to that, which is really great to work with.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Absolutely amazing. And some similarities in a very small way to what I'm trying to do here with this is that we've got those stories and just giving people the opportunity without quite knowing where it's going to go to share those. How old were you when you found yourself out there making that project?
I was in my early 30s.
Early 30s.
Yeah.
And what was that like to be in that place?
I thought I wasn't going to come home alive.
Okay.
I was quite terrified. Just to be somewhere very remote. I was the only woman with a crew of 5 Finnish film, different crew members and a couple of Russians. But because I was the producer, I was the sort of had to keep it going. The director and I, were in charge of what was happening, but it was elected somehow that I was in charge of the dollars, the cash that we had to, facilitate making the film. So I slept every night with my head on this leather satchel of cash, and that's when I started to get first grey hairs.
Wow. How does that actually feel then? What are the emotions? Because you talk quite...
It was very intense, but it was a really profound life experience, and met amazing people that we filmed with, and in different places. We were in Moscow, we saw amazing things, learned a lot about history. But in Siberia, it was something about that rural rhythm that completely connected with me. And that was something, I'd been living a very urban life. Right. And, there was no bathing facilities where we were staying. We had to go in this plywood factory, banya, to clean ourselves. And I was in there late one night. We were filming on these swamps during the day. It was very gruelling hours. But there was a picture of a thatched cottage, like a Devon thatched cottage on the... it was really unexpected. And I saw that and sort of felt a bit homesick. And then when I got back to London, my mother sent me an advert for this thatched cottage to rent in Cornwall. And I applied for it. And that after that, what that priest had said, I just decided I'm moving to Cornwall, going to live in that cottage.
So there was
another turning point.
Quite, and the language around this is personal, but almost there's a spiritual aspect to that part of the story you're telling, in the sense that, that moment with the priest where he looked you in the eyes, that visual image of this cottage, which was so out of place, but kind of drew you back to some of those things perhaps you talked about in childhood, and the horses.
There was a horse and a dog in Siberia, And I immediately was like they kept me going when it was tough going. And horse and dog had always been important in my life. And so when I moved to that cottage in Cornwall, I got a horse and a dog, and I called the dog after the dog I'd met in Siberia. He was called Drozok, which means little friend. And I got this Samoyed puppy, Drozok. And so it's sort of, I picked up on that. But one of the guys we'd interviewed in Siberia was an old war veteran, and he looked like my Uncle Fred, who'd been a farmer in Cornwall. And talking with him, he was well into his 80s at the time, this man. And I remember him looking at me very directly, I don't speak Russian, but through the interpreter, and saying, "And what about that Thatcher?" And he was very in tune with, the politics of Britain and all sorts of things. And it was just that sense of being reminded of my ancestors, but just a different way of life. And I just thought, I'm actually through with this urban life. And that's the mask. I tried really hard to be an urban person and pursue that. And I just, the day that I started that edit in Soho was the day I also decided I'm moving to that cottage.
Oh, so I want to ask this question and I can't really phrase it that well, but I'll attempt it, and you might not even be able to answer it because it's not well formed in my own mind. When I listen to you talk, and you talk about yourself as a storyteller, and I'm hearing the story of your life, I wonder if you see yourself as writing that story? Because the way you're talking about these links, do you think there's an agency in that? Do you think you are authoring it? Or do you see yourself as the observer, as the documentary maker who's... Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it does, because I think I think it was about that time in my life that I began writing. When I moved to Cornwall, I had been screenwriting and writing for, professionally, but I wasn't writing personally, or I wasn't writing stories that might have arisen in my own mind. And it was at that time, when I moved to that cottage, that I just began a flood of writing of all sorts. In terms of authoring my own life, I think it's that case of where I've played certain roles and then sometimes had to pull back and think, hold on, that's not me. And so it's not so much authoring my life as trying to make sense of myself, and maybe why sometimes I am really not happy or feel very conflicted about what am I doing or why am I doing this? And then how do I sort of realign that for what's right for me as opposed to what's right for on your CV? Recently, I was again, rewriting the CV, and I just thought it's just, you've got that professional face, but I just did it with a parallel column of life events. Because it only makes sense if you actually see the life events, which is a little bit like what you're doing with the podcasts. And I thought, because that's the truth, as opposed to that sort of lens of where you just say certain things to make it look like you're a sanitized version of yourself rather than, the fully faceted person.
There's a recruitment podcast episode on that, I think. Can I take you back? Because I think for the listener, there's something really interesting in what you're talking about in terms of your ability to recognise, to be self-aware and recognise when you've got to that point and make a change. Have there been any themes or patterns, just in your own personal experience, that have been the signals of that have been this isn't right for me. There is a mask here. I need to change. What are the signals?
Real frustration and unhappiness. Yeah, and that sense of I've now built something and I now need to pull the rug because that's not for me. And I think that constant alignment of how do you find that balance of your true self and then the self you need to function in the rest of the world.
And how do you think you found strength, if you like, or the bravery to make the change? Because I think a lot of us find ourselves in that position, but not necessarily everyone would then say, right, I'm leaving Soho and off to live in a thatched cottage. Where does that come from, that ability to take an action?
I didn't see there was any choice. I just didn't see there was an option to continue where I was, because it wasn't for me anymore. You know, I had tried it and it really wasn't for me. And I needed to do something that was where I felt my feet were on the ground and that I was able to live in the way that I could, you know, that made me a happier person.
And did you find that in the thatched cottage?
I did, yes.
Yeah?
It was a great spot. Yeah.
Lovely, lovely. Let's jump then, maybe to things that are more current and to sort of later turning points. What was another? If we jump the story ahead from the thatched cottage, where do we next land in terms of a turning point?
I think the next turning point was that I, with what became my husband, we got the tenancy of a duchy farm in North Cornwall, and from, you know, having some awareness of agriculture but not really that much hands-on, we became part-time farmers. And so from knowing, you know, that grass was green, yeah, but not about all the different types of grass and how does it become green and why and this and that, for 10 years we farmed on this, you know, what's called SSSI site, you know, sites of science, special scientific interest, and began breeding, you know, native breed animals. So a very steep learning curve, very, very hands-on, but also a huge inspiration for a lot of work on my part, and just learning that there was a world completely separate from that very sort of, you know, front brain world of the filmmaking. And I really enjoyed that hands-on relationship with working with the animals and working in the landscape.
So were you still filmmaking at the time, or did you shift?
Yeah,
so it was both?
Doing both. Actually, there was another turning point before that, because I did have a bad car accident. And that made me, I couldn't do what I had been doing with work because I had a brain injury. But in that time of having to learn to live from a different axis, my language was affected. So as a writer, it was pretty difficult. That I then began painting again, and I found that where the writing was all a bit agonised, the painting was full of colour and joy. So it was that gave me a different way in, and I also got like a small digital video camera. And so where I'd been a screenwriter and producer, I just began filming whatever was going on the doorstep on the farm as my way of being able to answer to my own wishes to make films. So I began doing short films on different projects as well, and finding a lot of freedom and pleasure in doing that.
So I think one of the things I'm interested in, this theme of nature, is obviously weaving through, like you said, from that film at the age of 8 and the horses and the animals. And we've got, probably we can all understand, a romanticised version of what 10 years on a farm and that steep learning curve was like. What was reality like? What was it really like to do that, to take that huge leap
hard work
we've all dreamed of?
Yes, really, really hard work. I mean, physically grueling. You know, we had 2 children as well, so there was no downtime. But I was also really just responding to that in like drawing, writing, doing the video all the time. My husband was a green woodworker, so we were doing horse logging. I was working on some of the carpentry projects with him, and just really finding a satisfaction, in working with a chisel rather than sat at a desk with a computer. And that also was a bit of a shift away from something I had begun to find very difficult, working with the words on the computer, into working with different parts of my body and my mind, and finding, how do I get a balance between those things as well.
And what is the balance? How did you find?
I'd say it's about 50-50, filmmaking, farmer.
How old are you at this point?
I was sort of, by the time we left the farm, I'd be in my early mid-40s.
Right. Yeah. So, and what was it that sort of brought that chapter to an end? What was the shift that happened?
Well, we were in a tenanted farm, and the rent had trebled in the period we'd been there. So it was no longer viable as a sort of, as a small farm, and then both having 2 full-time careers to make it work economically. So this had been sort of, we'd been aware of this for a while. And so the next big turning point had been the research, the recce's up to Scotland, looking for alternatives as to where could we live, raise the children and keep our animals, but without this huge economic pressure of a high rent. So we decided to get a croft on the Outer Hebrides, and the intention was to build a house and start again with the animals, but with a completely different basis of how was that going to work financially, but also living in a really different community.
Mm. I wish I was a filmmaker now and we could just pop out there, because I think I'm for the first time regretting being an audio-only medium. Take me to the Outer Hebrides. Could you, I don't know, can you remember that first visit? Could you take us through what you see, what you heard?
We'd gone up several times to different parts of the West Highlands, like, first of all, on a holiday.
Yeah.
And it was on that holiday I realised, this is for me, because it was just much quieter place than Cornwall with the commercial tourism and the what that brings. But it was also because we kept meeting people who were farming in ways similar to us on a small scale. And I just loved the light and the landscape. We had looked at different crofts on the mainland, and there were ifs and buts about all of them. And it was the first time we went over to the Outer Hebrides, to Uist, which is like the long, thin chain of 5 islands below Harris, that we then saw here is a community, whereas elsewhere in the West Highlands there was often not a lot of active community in that same way, and the children were little, they were just starting primary school. So it was that sense of, well, what would their life be like if there's nobody for 50 miles or something? So it was that idea that although you're a long way from anywhere else, there was a very active community, and the crofting community was really, really strong. So that had great appeal. And the light is just breathtaking. So for me, it was really... And I also remember the first time we visited, going for a walk, and this story arising in my mind, and then going back and just 6 or 7 hours... it just flowed out of it. There were a couple of situations like that where I could just really hear my imagination very clearly, and then I could answer to it, because that way of life, that environment was much quieter than the demands of the life down in Cornwall.
Again, to me, my quite a spiritual element to that part of the story, of the way your imagination responded to that place. Do you see it that way, or?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that's what I find very hard in. Then, how did you present yourself to the rest of the world? Because you don't present those elements; you present, other things. But for me, those were the things. But that's the base from which my work arises, and that connection with those things is the touchstone for all the ideas. So. Finding that way of connecting, but also then how do you make that work with earning a living? That was the real beginning to reconcile with that.
Mm. Have you aligned those two? You say you don't present that. Is that still a belief?
On my most recent project is where I began to, whilst I was on the Hebrides, because I made a lot of work, but I also became... instead of being a screenwriter and producer, I evolved into being what you call a self-shooting director. So I started making my own long-form films, documentary series, feature-length documentaries, And I also, from having been an editor when I was much younger, I hadn't made the change into digital editing. And then when I was on the Hebrides, I just went for it. And so that meant that I didn't need that big team that you used to need to make something, and I could then be really productive. And that gave me great flexibility too. What I did was when we began crofting, I was so compelled by what we were doing. I was photographing it and filming it, and that eventually, over 6 years, became a 3-hour series for BBC Alba.
So that allowed those two sides to come together.
That it was called It's in the Blood. It was for Alba's the Gaelic language part of the BBC Scotland, and that actually started with a bit of archive from my dad's 9mm film of Uncle Fred on the farm down in Cornwall. So it does connect back to everything, but it was that sense of keeping a rhythm going. And that series was literally filmed on my doorstep as I was crofting with my family and with our neighbours. That was a big turning point in terms of making something that was much more personal. But also I was actually then directing, which is what I had always wanted to do. But it was in a totally different way than I had originally imagined.
Just a quick pause. At Reflective Rebels, I'm on a mission to spread joy. I create these podcast conversations because I think we're all hungry for something real. Not advice, not quick fixes, just honest, human stories that remind us we're not alone in the mess. If this conversation is making you feel something, would you help me grow the rebellion and share it with just one person who might need to hear it? Maybe someone who's also tired of pretending everything's fine. Because every person who finds these stories makes this little rebellion against perfectionism and exhaustion a little bit stronger. Back to our conversation. So what's that shift then allowed since then in terms of the work that you've been doing and the kind of things that you've been creating?
That opened a lot of... I then just became in that role and then made several more films on the Hebrides. So I had actually moved to the Hebrides planning I would write and paint all the time.
Yeah.
And it was quite unexpected that I actually suddenly then became really busy with filming. But again, over about a 10-year period, I made a number of both long-form films for broadcast, but also a lot of short films for businesses and organisations, ranging from, best practice for agriculture to all different, housing association. It was really productive time and really enjoyable because I got to meet amazing people, fantastic locations, wonderful places to film. And, it was really good.
So where does that bring us to now? How are you finding meaning? I use the word joy, but, those things that light us up inside, where are they coming from now?
Well, having been on the Hebrides for quite a long time, I decided after my children went away to study, well, just to backtrack a little bit, I did build a house, we did create the croft, we did start again with cattle and sheep and all sorts of things. But then I realised, after COVID, it was very difficult with the transport. The ferries had, become quite difficult. And I just decided I wanted to be back on the mainland to make logistics for life and for work slightly easier. So I moved 2 years ago to Dumfries. And during that time, I had been making a film in the Borders. And I think I just wanted to make it possible to have a base that was easier to come and go from, but also, again, shifting or developing the axis from which I worked. And that film was a feature-length documentary that I singularly failed to get any institutional funding from the screen industries. And that was a turning point for me because I had shot a lot of it and then realised I'm not going to get funding. What am I going to do? And over the years of, developing projects and coming up with ideas, there's a room in my house which is full of boxes of what I think of as like my unborn children. You know, they're the films or stories that have never got out into the world. And I couldn't bear that this most recent project was going in that room.
It's going to be.
So I just decided, actually, I'm going to find a way to finish this. And that was a big turning point, because previously I'd always stopped if I couldn't get funding or couldn't get approval. And whereas this, I was really compelled by the people I'd filmed with, by the story that was being told. And I just then found ways to get parts of the edit done until I was at a point where I could launch a crowdfunder, and then got support. And that was a massive turning point, that in 4 weeks I was able to raise completion funding for something I had singularly failed to raise anything for from conventional sources for 4 years. And then that film is the first that I've self-distributed. And that has been a fantastic experience of having first-hand contact with cinemas, festivals and audiences, in terms of saying, well, my instinct for what was interesting in that story has resonated with all these people, and that as it's screened, it continues to move and inspire people. And that has really given me a completely different value system on which I want to make work, because it's how distorting it can be when you are pursuing funding and then you've got to adhere to a certain agenda to get, you know, meet their criteria in order to get the thing made, but then the thing might not be as strong as you wanted it to be. And this this recent film has just given me, it's affirmed that that's the right way to work.
So another big shift, a bit like that trip to Europe where you found a new freedom or a new way to be you and create. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think? Did you learn anything about yourself in that most recent period of change in terms of?
I learned that you've got to pace yourself, because I was really fully on getting that film finished, as well as moving from the Hebrides. So the move had to be organised around stages of the edit and fundraising. I was pretty much on my own on that project, with a number of hats. And so last year when I finished it, I was like, I had no energy left for any more films. And I just took the wrecking bar out onto the house I'd moved into and began renovating it, and just did building work for a number of months, because it was that thing I need to recharge. So there's a sense of like pacing yourself through it. But there was also this really heartening sense of when you go direct to people, you're getting a very positive relationship. And that is just fantastic to see that, to get audience feedback, to get venues feeding back, and then think, okay, so how does that become the way I work? Because when you go to the big organisations and they've got a set strategy and a format of how they want to work, and they tell you what audiences want, it's what they perceive their audience want. And that might be like a mass audience. It might be like McDonald's hamburger audience. But what if I'm doing prime steak? And I just always aligned it back to, I used to direct market the meat that we produce, the beef, the pork and the lamb. And I just see that what I do is like that. It's like a rare breed animal that's grown for longer and grass-fed without lots of intensive, it's organically. It's a total different product. So it needs a total different way of production and then a total different way of route to market. So sort of the agriculture has informed the creative work.
And the rhythm of that creation.
Yes. Yeah.
What was I going to ask? I was going to ask, so I can feel your passion and probably conviction for what you're doing now. What would you say about sort of where you found yourself is really fueling that sense of excitement and conviction that this is what I want to do?
Well, obviously your motto, life's too short to be shit,
yeah.
is that I feel that the last film is probably... I also made an experimental short film for Glasgow School of Art, which became a more personal style in recent years. And I just felt like these are only just starting to be something that reflects me, as opposed to a commissioned work that more or less anybody could have made. And so I feel that commitment that I need to answer to what is what I do and why is that different from what anybody else does, that resolve is now there. And that's what I'm concentrating on. And also the fact that I have worked in several different types of medium, you know, the film, the painting, the writing, drawing, photography. And I'm now like working on how do I consolidate and unify these into how I do a project. And that project is coming from my core.
So this is perhaps impossible to answer. You can just say, "Oh, shut up." But just picking up on what you said there, who are you, or what is you? What is that you-ness that you've come to?
I'm fundamentally quite independently minded.
Yeah.
But I am a filmmaker. I am a farmer, and I am a creative person. You know, I write and I paint, and I don't think there's an easy label on that, but that is me, you know. And it's not that I am totally different people, but those things all interact, and I just want to bring them that they are interacting on a daily basis, as opposed to one person for 6 months and then another person for 5 years. And, you know, I now want to learn from what I've been doing and take those forward together with a balance.
And having got to that point, if you were to go back to that 8-year-old who'd just watched that movie, would you have anything to say to that 8-year-old version of you?
Yes, to stay true to yourself and not try to, you know, don't people please. You know, to carve your own path and find a way, because what I have found on that last film is that I really did I answered to my gut. This is a strong story. These are fantastic people. And having seen audience feedback, you know, we had a screening on Monday night at Catstrand in New Galloway, and it's just, you get this really powerful audience response. And it's like, well, that makes it make sense, because you're not just creating in a vacuum. And that has really affirmed that gut instinct is a correct barometer to create work and live by.
Yeah.
And I think in earlier stages of my life, when we've talked about big turning points, it's where I've gone way off from that barometer, and then I've had to pull the rug to realign it. And so if I have gained any wisdom across my life, it's to align those things and then keep them all at the centre of your life, in balance with each other.
Yeah. And I can sort of feel a mirror when you're talking, because you have that image of you on the horse and that idea of grounding. And I sort of see a mirror there in the connection you've got with the audience now. It's a sense of that being connected in a full circle to where that story's going, not just the creating of it, but then to see the impact of it on people and people's lives. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. So where does that leave you in terms of what's next?
Well, what next is I am very grateful to have recently been awarded what's called a Support for Ambition grant from Arts D&G. And that has enabled me to undertake an R&D time on my next project.
Yeah.
The whole point of this next project is that it does consolidate everything. So that over the time, really, since I moved down to that thatched cottage, I was, as I say, generating poems, short stories. I began just recording my day-to-day life, not because I wanted to do something specific. It was just my way of how I was at that time. But I have also drawings and paintings of all different things. And there was a certain point a few years ago where I realised there's a narrative through that. None of it was created to be something, but it was all contemporaneous. It was really like my way of how do I deal with being in the world.
Yeah.
But that work has never been shared. And with this R&D grant, I've then spent a couple of months getting all of this out, including all the things that I've collected and moved with over many years. So say like, artifacts from the landscapes I've worked in, the horns of my old bull, the mane and tail off my old horse. And it's like most people probably don't move with these things. But I have got them there, and then I've got them all out thinking, right, how do they all come together? Because they're all part of something. And so I'm working out how there will be a film, there will be a book, but there will also be an exhibition or installation where these things integrate. And that's the task, is how do I integrate how I create work? And that there is a clear narrative within this piece of work, but it's also the style of it. So I'm just experimenting right now and formulating on the pragmatic part of the brain, how do I take that forward? And using the experience on my last film to inform, do I work with the crowd economy again? And also, how do I work through self-distribution or building non-conventional venues so that I can get that work out in different formats to audiences?
Wow, and that really is you.
Yeah.
It literally is you and your life and your story. So how does it feel right now to be working on that project? What does it feel like?
It feels like a radio, an old-fashioned radio, with an analog dial button rather than a digital tuning. It feels like I have had my hand on that dial all my life, trying to find where's the channel, where's the bit where you actually get the clear signal, and it feels like, gosh, I'm nearly at the clear signal.
What can you hear then? What's the little sound that you're starting to hear?
It's first of all clearing a lot of rubbish out of my head, getting myself out of my own way. You should be, or what will so and so think, or getting rid of all that, and then just thinking, what do I want to do with this, and getting on with it. So that is like where that Friday night feeling becomes almost every day.
Everything. That's just wonderful. I'm so excited to see the result. Yeah.
I am excited as well, because I am a bit overwhelmed. There's a lot of material, and I've had to spend a lot of time just getting a workflow established and getting like, oh my God, you've had all this buried. What are you going to do with it? But now I sort of feel I've begun to get an order. I've begun to get a system of how, breaking it down, I'll do this bit and then that bit. And I know I've then got to overcome the taking it out into the world. How do I finance the stages of development? But I just feel that I know what I've got is really visceral, really raw, and that it will connect with people because there's a twin in theme to my last film. Mm-hmm. And I've seen that people have... It's been really powerful, cathartic journey for people, and they've really wanted something that has depth, that does resonate, and they have an emotional connection with. So it's like I'm sticking with that, and it's not going to get distorted by having to adhere to some funding thing that makes it something other than what it is.
That's beautiful, and brings us right back full circle. And I think we're out of time. So that is it. I can't thank you enough for sharing just glimpses, I think, of that story, which we're about to see more of. I wonder how people might follow you or sort of connecting to be ready to hear the rest of that story if they're interested to know more when that finally gets released into the world. What's the best way for people to...
At the moment, my website and my social handle is TrixPix Media.
Yeah.
But that's very much, I feel like... it's one thing I've been working on this summer is it's time for a rebrand. So Trix Pix Media is a production company.
Yeah,
it's a more generic thing. So I think that Beatrix Wood will appear as the website and the social handles, as a completely separate entity. And that will be how it evolves.
So watch this space.
Yes.
Watch this space. Thank you very much. That's just been incredible. Oh, that was amazing. Yeah, can we just do the rest of the series? How was that for you?
That was good. You're really great about asking the right questions.
Do you think I was?
Yes.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation stirred something in you, I hope you feel you're not alone. Sometimes hearing someone else's story can help us see our own more clearly. Please support the telling of these stories by following or subscribing wherever you're listening to your podcasts. You can visit reflectiverebels.co.uk/newsletter to sign up for honest insights, podcast updates, and events for exhausted humans. And if you're ready for change in your own story, if you want to move from coping to clarity, from performing to living, then drop me an email about coaching. Because we're done pretending everything's fine. We want more than coping. We want a life that feels like ours. Your story isn't over yet. I'm Ben, and this has been We're Done Pretending, a Reflective Rebels podcast.